Today we are joined by fellow artist and writer Jeff Goins. He just came out with a book called Real Artists Don't Starve, and I loved it so much that I wanted him on the show to chat about all of it, including the stuff that didn't make it into the book. So as just a little bit of a background though, Jeff wrote the national bestseller book called The Art of Work, which I also loved. And so I was really stoked to have this conversation with him because he has a really in-depth background as an artist, as a working artist, and we get to talk about that today. We also get to talk about how challenges always beckon new opportunities. We talk about the value of constraints as a working and thriving creative, and we talk about the differences between a starving artist and a thriving artist, which is what his book is all about. It's really great, you guys. And then we also chat a little bit about the financial mindset required to become a thriving artist. So if you're in a starving artist mindset, this is a good one to listen to because I think it'll help you push you into the thriving zone. So even if you don't classify yourself as an artist though, this is going to be a good episode for you to listen to because Jeff has some really valuable nuggets of wisdom to offer all of us today, especially in regards to bravery. So with that, I give you Jeff Goins. You're listening to Bare Naked Bravery, a weekly podcast hosted by me, Emily Ann Peterson. As a singer-songwriter, author, teaching artist, and creative entrepreneur, I encounter some really fascinating stories. I'm on a mission to reveal the depth and width of bravery and its benefits to creatives like yourself. More than ever today, our world needs bravery, unique bravery, from everyone. This is the place where you find it. There is no script or censorship today because that's how these facets of bare naked bravery are in real life. So if you're listening with little ears nearby, please know that some episodes may contain mature language and subject matter. One of the easiest ways you can share bravery with the world is to send this episode to a friend or two. Send them an email, text, or tweet. Tag them in one of my Instagram posts. My handle is Emily Ann Pete. Or leave us a review on iTunes. It takes seconds and can be done from your phone right now. Again, we need more bravery in the world. So let's be brave together. So Jeff Goins, you are here with us today, and I'm really stoked to have this conversation with you because I've just been reading your brand new book. I'm a slow reader, so it took me 2 weeks just because I get distracted and everything. But Real Artists Don't Starve is the title. It's so appropriate, especially for my life because I'm an artist that makes money off of my art and my living as an artist. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's worth it. And it was really good to hear someone reiterate some of the same things that I already know, and like it was like the pat on the back of like, you're doing good job.
Yeah
it was great. I'm curious though because you covered a lot of really interesting topics in the book, but I wanted to start by talking about what is it that didn't make it in the book.
Yeah, that's a fun question. To start, I mean, this is probably just my own ego or whatever, but like this was my first hardcover book, and I had this idea that like this needs to be like a 300-page book or something because, you know, that's what like a real book looks like or whatever, you know? So I kind of like padded the book when I was writing it, just because I had so many great stories and I did a lot of research.
Well, and this is not your first rodeo. You've written many, many, many books. So
yeah, so this is my 5th book and it's my first hardcover. And I don't know, I just had some idea that it had to be a certain length and all of that. So the book is 12 rules about how to move from starving to thriving as a creative, whatever that means to you. I think, you know, artist is becoming more and more of a broadly applicable term, which I love. I think it's good, like not just painters. So yeah, so originally there were 15 chapters, there were 15 rules. So there were 3 ideas that I either cut or combined with something else. But when I start writing a book, and I'm sort of a writer by trade, but I had a stint as a musician. I was an actor in college and used to draw when I was a kid. So I I've kind of danced around a lot of the arts. And the reason that I wrote the book is because my whole life, whatever the creative pursuit was, most people told me, hey, that's great that you, like when I was playing music professionally, making $8,000 a year. And I was 23. And to keep costs down, my band and I would stay in people's homes. And I mean, without fail, we'd hear people saying, that's great, get that out of your system while you're young, because when you get older, life is different. Or I would hear like, this is good to do while you're young, but later on you're going to have to grow up, or otherwise you're going to starve, was this idea that I kept hearing over and over and over again. And so I wrote this book because I keep meeting so many people like yourself, Emily, who are not necessarily world famous, household names, but you're making a living off of your art. You're thriving. So first of all, I don't think the opposite of a starving artist is a rich artist, although that can happen too. It's a thriving artist, which is what most creatives that I know want to do. They want to make their art and make a living doing it so that they can spend the most amount of time doing this thing that they love. And let's be honest, getting paid for your art is a validating experience. Anyway, all that to say, there was a bunch, like when I was chasing this idea, I didn't really know what it was about. I just knew that I knew this whole movement, it seemed like an underground movement of people that I call thriving artists that we weren't hearing about. So we know the story of the starving artist, right? We've heard that, most of us, our whole lives. I didn't hear as much the story of the thriving artist. And so that was something that's really interesting to me.
It's really interesting. You mentioned you tie in the fame quotient, right?
Yeah.
You don't need to be famous to be making a living off of your art. And I remember I was sitting in a music industry convention and we were in one of these breakout panels on like publicity. And I was sitting in the midst of a couple other singer-songwriters like myself. And the whole hour, it was just the the guys that were on the panel discussion were just like bad mouthing the industry and how like doomed it was. We got to the end of the conversation and I could tell everyone around me was just so disheartened. They were like, I have to have a bajillion Facebook followers in order for anybody to look my way. And I like grabbed them all by the shoulder and I was like, you'd only need 1,000 people to be on your email list. You're going to be okay. And they all looked at me like, we are?
Yeah. I mean, that's that whole Kevin Kelly thing, 1,000 true fans. And it may be true. Like I live in Nashville, which is, Music City, USA. And a friend of mine recently quit working at a record label. And I said, why did you leave that job? He said, I knew that this was over. Like I knew that I was done here when we had a company meeting and the company's CEO said, hey guys, we only made 12% of our budget this year. 12%.
Whoa.
Not missed it by 12%, only made 12% of our budget. So if you're trying to make $1 million, you made $120,000 instead. It was a lot more than that. But we only made 12% of our budget this year, but people are still buying CDs. So we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. Like that was the speech. People are still buying CDs. What? A, no, they're not. B, you missed your target by 88%.
Clearly they're...
C, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. Anyway, he was like, I was out after that. So, there's a really interesting thing that's happening in our world, particularly in creative industries, and you were privy to it, Emily, which is that the whole institution, the industry, whatever it is, music, publishing, they all see the writing on the wall and go, this thing is, you can't sell books anymore. You can't sell music anymore. Except that there are all these other people, particularly who are doing it independently or doing it in some interesting, unique, scrappy way, not following the rules that are 25 years old, but doing what works now and succeeding. So for every gloom and doom thing that happens, and we'll use music as an example, like CD sales, music sales in general are down, there's an opportunity, and in the case of music, concert tickets, event sales are through the roof. So value is just shifting, and it's still possible for creatives to make a living, to thrive off of their art. And I would say the argument of the book is not only is it possible, the opportunity has never been better. And yeah, I hear people say, well, what about this? What about that? There are new challenges, but with every challenge, there's a new opportunity. And I've been in Nashville for 10 years. And when I moved here, the indie scene really was just, there's always been kind of an indie scene, as long as I've been alive, but it wasn't a thing. And now, 8 or 9 out of 10 musicians I know are independent artists, and they're doing much, much better than when they wanted a label to take care of them. Anyway, so all that to say, it was a fun book to write, and I think now is the best time to be creative.
Well, let's go back to the editing process, because I'm curious which ones didn't make it in the book.
Right.
Now that I've read all of them.
Yeah. Okay, so there's this little piece of an idea in the book, in the rule of the portfolio. So every chapter is a rule, and the 11th rule is the starving artist tries to master one thing, whereas the thriving artist masters many things. And this is something that I think is a little bit counterintuitive. So if you want to be a cellist, you need to be playing, you want to be Yo-Yo Ma or whatever, you need to be playing your instrument since you're 2 years old and just do that, right? And that isn't always the best way to build a thriving, successful career in your creative work. Now, on one hand, we don't want to be a jack of all trades. I don't believe that's the best way to do your best work, but we do want to become a master of some. And so there's this idea of the portfolio life, which I'm a big proponent of. And you find that most people who are succeeding in creative work today are typically taking 2 or 3 different unlikely things and combining them. This happens in music. This happens in art. This is how some of the best innovation happens. It also happens that if you're doing a few different things at once, growing different skills and combining them in different ways, you're also minimizing your risk, right? You're likely creating multiple income streams. You are, like, for example, I know lots of musicians who are now becoming authors. And they're packaging their books with their music and selling them together. And one is pointing to the other. That's a different income stream. That's an opportunity when you kind of open up the vantage point that you don't just have to do one thing. So when I was chasing this idea, something that I cut from the book was 4,000 or 5,000 words of interviews I did with all these psychology professors about this idea called the leaky filter. I don't know about you, Emily, but I am typically a distracted person. And this was something that I see a lot with a lot of my creative friends. Like, they can't focus, and there's all this pressure to just focus. And there's this shame that goes along with it. Like, if I could just focus, I know that I could become more successful. Well, there's all this interesting psychological research about distraction, even ADHD. And there's this huge correlation between creative output and ADD and ADHD. That's really, really fascinating. And so it turns out that getting distracted, and this is represented in the book a little bit, but there's all this fun, research that I did that I was like, it didn't really work in the book because it was like, why is he going on for 3 chapters about, the way the brain works? It was fun, but there's this whole idea that's called the leaky filter. And a leaky filter basically means that you're thinking about lots of things at the same time. And growing up, I always heard that was a liability. In school and all of these institutions and settings where you're supposed to do one thing. But the truth is that as a best-selling author and as an online entrepreneur, my greatest successes have typically come from me doing one thing and then getting an idea about something else and going, oh, and we could do that too. And I think you have to rein that in. I mean, this is sort of the challenge of it, is figuring out how to harness distraction as a tool. And the technical definition, technical word for it is leaky filter. But it's this idea that while you're doing one thing, you are thinking about other things, which allows you to recognize opportunities that if you were completely focused on one task, you would miss.
Yeah. I know, the way that shows up for me is I constantly do a zoom in, zoom out,
yeah.
Zoom in,
that's great. That's
zoom
smart.
out. So I end up being focused on the one thing, but I'm there's that constant adjusting my focus to include other elements in it. And I encourage when I taught cello lessons full time, I encourage, that was always what every lesson with a student was like, okay, what's the one
Yeah.
thing you're going to focus on? Okay, let's integrate that back into the whole piece. Now let's pick
Yeah.
another fun thing and another one thing and then do the same
Yeah.
thing. So, I mean, it really does work.
Yeah, and I love that idea, that implicit idea that you just shared, which is you are creating a body of work. So in order to do that, you have to pick something small to focus on for a period of time, but then you get to move on to something else. And if you're doing this well, over time, you're integrating all this stuff that you're creating, all these different ideas into a portfolio. And this is a smart career move because now all of a sudden you don't just do one thing. Like I know a guy who basically was a writer for 30 years, writer and editor, and he made his his bread and butter was publishers hiring him to edit books for them, and that just dried up these past few years. And now he's out of a job because he doesn't understand technology, doesn't understand marketing, doesn't get blogging or the internet. He's a baby boomer, and he's really struggling to catch up. I mean, that's the risk of mastering one thing. And I love the quote in Robert Greene's book, Mastery, where he says, the future belongs to people who take different skills and combine them in interesting ways. So we just have to reimagine the way we think of mastering a craft, because typically the world's greatest innovations are borrowing from different sources and recombining them in interesting ways. And this is, as you mentioned, fun for a lot of us. It also allows you to see different opportunities through that leaky filter. And then lastly, it can create multiple income streams, which provides some security for, the future.
Yeah. We get to talk with Emily from puttytribe.com.
Yeah, she's great. Mm-hmm.
In a couple weeks. I'm really excited about that because she's all about the same thing. It's like, why are we giving ourselves such a big guilt trip about being multi-potential and having so many different areas to focus on? That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing that we get to bring all of our skills, all of our experience into this melting pot of uniqueness.
Yeah. There's a difference between that and just being sloppy. And that is the challenge. And that is the art that you have to create, is how do I take these different things and combine them into what is my portfolio? And you have to do that well. And I believe you can't say yes to everything, but you need to say yes to more than one thing. And like you said, I love that idea of zooming in and zooming out, constantly hyper-focusing and then pulling out and thinking about the big picture.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. In reference to your artistic experience, you have so much. You dabbled in music, dabbled in theater. Now you do online business stuff and you're a writer and you've made your way around the bend a couple times. We talk about boundaries a lot on the show because it just happens when you're being vulnerable and brave with people. You have to set up some boundaries either for yourself or for somebody else. And that's kind of the nature of being vulnerable. And an artist has to be vulnerable all the time. You have to set up a boundary and then either reveal something or choose to not do that. So how do you find that yes and find that no in the way you do life right now?
Like you're talking about like personal boundaries, saying yes to opportunities or no. Yeah. Man, this is this is probably my biggest struggle. I literally just had the thought, if I didn't have these boundaries, because I have kids, I've got a wife, if I didn't have these boundaries, I would be more successful. Like I had that thought.
Like just now you had that thought?
Well, like just before we did this interview.
Okay.
Yeah. There were certain things that were like not going well and I'm going, crap, if I just worked 12 hours a day, it'd be way easier. And I really struggled with that until I heard an interview on a podcast where the interviewer talked to, it was the first season of the Startup Podcast, where he interviewed Andrew Mason, the founder of Groupon. And he's no longer affiliated with Groupon. He's got another company that he started, but he's a dad now. And he said on that interview, he said, being a dad and having a family makes me less successful at business. He goes, I don't know why we don't say this, because like working 8 hours a day versus working 14 when I was doing the crazy, Silicon Valley thing, you can accomplish more in 14 hours. Like this idea that like, oh, it's quality over quantity. Well, at a certain point, quantity does beat quality, right? And so he basically said, I'm not as successful as I could be because I'm a dad, but it's worth it. And I think that is the challenge, whatever your boundaries are. Because it's one thing to say, Emily, you can be as successful as you want to be or as great as you want to be and have these boundaries, or these boundaries are going to help you. I think that's great. That's basically saying you get to have your cake and eat it too. And I think there's some truth to that. But what about the times when you don't? And this is the struggle for me. I recently launched this book and I intentionally didn't kill myself doing it because I wanted to talk about the book for a long time and not be sick of it, after it finally came out, which has happened before, like pushing, the big bestseller thing, and instead going, no, like I want this to be a message that is going to resonate with people for years to come. And in order to accomplish that goal, I've got to have this slow and steady, persevering attitude. So boundaries for me, like over the past few years, have gotten tighter and tighter and tighter. And the good of that is it has forced me to create more with less. And I think constraints are so important to creativity. I know that you get that, and it's like, it's very intimidating to look at this big canvas and go build your masterpiece. But when I look at my day, like yesterday I worked 5 hours, and I look at my day and I go, you got to do something now. It's like, I get up, I go, I do it, I come back. And it was a rushed day for me. Because it was just crazy, like I took my son to school, then I came back, then I picked him up, then we had to eat dinner, then he had to go somewhere else, and I was moving around. But there are two things about it. One, I was really enjoying it. By the end of the day, I felt accomplished. Like, those days when you work 8, 9, 10, 11 hours and you end the day and you just feel like crap because you still didn't get all the stuff done.
Or you can't remember what you got done, so you feel like you got nothing done.
Or you started 4 things after you finished the 8 things, and now you feel guilty that you didn't finish those things.
Oh yeah.
This doesn't happen all the time, but yesterday, I felt like I did everything that I needed to do, and part of the reason was I wasn't jacking around. I had exactly the amount of time that I needed to work. So I work about 25 hours a week, sometimes 30, sometimes 35, rarely 40. I don't say that to brag. I don't know that I'm proud of that or anything, but it works for me. Because, the interesting thing about being a writer is, most professional writers spend 2, 3, 4, at most maybe 6 hours a day doing their work. It's exhausting. I mean, and when I was playing music, like we were driving 12 hours a day and then we were playing a show for an hour or 2 maybe, and there's lots and lots of years of practice that goes in, before you get to that point. But for me, the good of having boundaries is the stuff that I'm able to do is the really good stuff, and everything else I go, well, I'm not going to worry about that. And then the downside is every once in a while I'll catch a glimpse of somebody else's life because the internet makes it very easy to see how great other people's lives are. And I'll go, oh, look what they're doing, And then I go, oh, I wish I didn't have this, this, and this. And then every once in a while, like my wife will go on a trip or something. And when we were married early on, I used to think if I didn't have any of these constraints, schedule, this, that, I could just do whatever I want to be so creative. And then like once or twice a year, my wife leaves. She doesn't, go on many trips by herself. And she leaves and I binge on Netflix and eat crappy food. And she comes back after the weekend or the week that she's gone. And I'm like, I didn't do anything. And I had all this time and I didn't do anything. And so I just realized the constraints are good. And they're good for 2 reasons. One, it makes you do the stuff that you need to do, the most essential things. And then 2, all that other stuff is good too. The constraints create room to enjoy the rest of life. And I love that part in Stephen King's memoir on writing where he said, I used to think that life was a support system for art. And now I realize that it's the other way around. And I find that as I'm living life, that's feeding the art. And while I'm creating, that's, can obviously be feeding the life. It's not about balance. It's more about, as Dan Miller calls it, integration. I'm integrating my life with my art. And there are seasons of busyness, with the art and the business. And there are seasons of busyness with the family. But recently, the week my book came out, My wife went on one of these trips, first time in a year. First time she had left me home with both kids for an extended period of time. I've got a 1-year-old and a 5-year-old. This is the week my book came out and she left. Everybody's like, what are you doing? But we agreed to this like 6 months beforehand. And I said, well, first of all, with a book launch, a lot of the work is leading up to this point. Second, I'm reminding myself of why I'm doing this in the first place.
Yeah.
So I am on this experiment, and it's not easy because I like to say yes to every opportunity, but I am on this experiment to create as much constraint as I can with my work and see what the output looks like. So I used to work 60 hours a week and the output was X. Then I shrunk it down to 50. Output was basically the same. Then 40, same output. 30, 25, and I just kept experimenting. And output for me is being up to date on like email, doing all of the appointments that I need to do interviews and things like that, and then getting a certain amount of writing done every single day and, publishing the blog posts and things like that. And I realized once I got to 25 hours a week, for me, like there was no difference between 25 and 60. And then once I went below that, I could start to see things suffering. So I go, okay, like this is my threshold. And there are weeks where I work more than this and a few weeks where I work less than this, but this is basically what I need to put in to do my work.
Before we get back to the conversation, I have just got to tell you about this awesome group of people I am honored to call my patrons. Every time a new song of mine is born, the first recording of it is tenderly revealed to this devoted group. They get to hear all my new material in its raw, fresh, vulnerable state and know that they are helping me do what I do. Because at the end of the day, they just want me to keep doing what I'm doing, and any reminder of that completely floors me every time I think about it. All of this support occurs through a website called patreon.com, which was started by this guy named Jack Conti, whose very attainable mission is to help every creator achieve sustainable income. In a world where artists are seen scrambling for pennies squeezed out of an expiring and broken economic system, the folks at Patreon have brought us back to what all creators used to do. Patronage is not new. But unlike a lot of popular crowdfunding sites out there, Patreon enables creators to receive support on a regular basis. The great thing is that my patrons set their pledges to whatever amount they feel comfortable with, which means patronage fits every budget out there. And of course, you can cancel at any time. If you're a creative type who's interested in joining Patreon yourself, I'd be happy to answer any questions I can. Just shoot me an email anytime. Bottom line, my patrons help me do everything I do, but better and more frequently. If you're interested in becoming a patron of mine, go to barenakedbravery.com/Patreon, Patreon. The topic of life supports art versus art supporting life.
Yeah.
That also ties to the financial mindset of an artist as well. Like if your life and the topic of day job to not day job or side hustle to not side hustle.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about some of the day jobs you've had.
Okay. As an adult, I've had a few day jobs. The first job I had out of college was I worked for this. I was a part of a band that was associated with a nonprofit group. So we would play these schools and prisons and churches, and I mean, very eclectic audience. And that was my first job. And like I said, I made $8,000 that year. And then I moved to Nashville to a year later to chase a girl who ended up becoming my wife. And I moved here and I worked in a call center, and I did that for 7 months and hated it, but was actually pretty good at it. But it was just, incredibly monotonous. And then after that, I became a marketing director at a nonprofit. I was actually hired as a writer in Georgia, where you are right now. And I telecommuted for 7 years, basically. I started out as a copywriter, then I became like a marketing manager, and ultimately became a marketing director of this organization. And all of these jobs were frustrating for me. And halfway through that marketing director job, my boss, who had become a mentor to me, told me that he said, basically in your 20s, you're going to go through a series of internships. And nobody really loves an internship. I guess some people do, but for most, it's like you're doing not fun stuff because that's what they need and they're not even willing to pay you for it typically. So, the idea of an internship, and I like thinking of it as a season of apprenticeship, you're basically doing whatever is needed for whatever pay is available so that you can gain the experience and knowledge that you can then take into a profession that you have more control over. So at some point that switched for me and I started to realize everything that I'm doing is education. Everything that I'm doing is preparation for what's to come. And so all this frustration, all this angst is temporary. And I can either go, oh, this sucks and I need to get out of here as quickly as possible, which honestly at 25, 26, 27, I was seeing a lot of my peers do. And I just saw where that led, So a lot of my coworkers would work with me for 6 months to 2 years, then they'd get bored and then they'd go chase their dream. And 6 months after that, they'd be, back working at Starbucks or something. And their dream was not to work at Starbucks. And so I was like, okay, well, that didn't last. So what did they do? Well, I think as soon as it got hard, they checked out. And what if I didn't do that? And what if I just leaned in a little bit? And I know I'm not going to be here forever, but tried to learn something from this. What if this was an apprenticeship? And like every 2 years, like every year or two at that 7-year job, I'd feel that, I'd feel angst. I'd go, this isn't fun anymore. And I'm bored and I want to do something else and I deserve better. And I would just go, okay, but just lean in a little bit, stay there a little bit longer. And I'd always learn something new. And to qualify this, I just want to be clear, like I had a nice boss, I didn't hate my job, but it was one of those things where I was comfortable and eventually got to this point where I realized they're not going to fire me. I could stay here forever. And that actually really scares me because this is safe and this isn't my calling. This isn't where I'm ultimately supposed to be. And from there, I transitioned into becoming a full-time writer, which was another process that took about 2 years. So what's interesting about all that stuff is I look back on basically those 3 jobs, musician, telemarketer, and marketing director. And especially with the last one, because I was there the longest, there is not a day, I truly mean this, there is not a day that goes by where I don't use a skill that I learned from those jobs.
It's totally true. Yep.
It's fun. Like, and I was doing all this for the book. I was doing all this research about apprenticeship. Mm-hmm. And typically an apprenticeship lasted 7 years. And I was at that job like 6.5 years. I was like, oh, that's cool. That was my apprenticeship. Now, to be clear, I really didn't, there were lots of things that frustrated me. So I was like, oh, this is great, guys. I'm going to be a full-time writer someday. I didn't know, but I do believe that everything in life is preparing you for what's to come. And if you're taking it all in, you're acting like an apprentice, which means you're being humble. You are learning whatever you can learn, and then also realizing this is temporary. No apprentice is working in the studio of a master going, I'm going to be here the rest of my life. And I think that's the thing that scares us about jobs that we don't like is I'm going to be here forever. Well, that organization, that business is probably not going to be there forever, much less you.
Especially if they're accepting 12% of their...
Yeah, right. Yeah. So use it and don't check out too soon and make what I call a seasonal commitment. I think 2 years is a good season where you can actually learn some stuff and take those skills and apply it somewhere else, particularly if you're going to be an artist. Because as you know, if you want to be a full-time artist, that means marketer, that means entrepreneur, that means networker. It means a bunch of different skills that you have to acquire. And why not get paid to acquire those skills? Like do it on somebody else's dime, and then you can take all that and apply it to your future career.
It's true. It's true. Okay, so I know you interviewed dozens and dozens of artists before writing this book. So I'm curious about their financial mindset about, I hear this all the time that like, oh, artists can't afford that, or musicians can't afford this, or, oh, I'm an artist's budget, blah, 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 all that
sure.
bullshit.
Yeah, right.
What did you learn from having all those conversations with those artists?
So there's sort of 2 parts to these stories. One was I really started the book because I stumbled upon this story about Michelangelo being the richest artist of the Renaissance, which was not something that I knew, nothing that I was told in art class growing up. And it's true. He had $50 million to his name, and he was the richest artist at that point who had ever lived. And super interesting because I would say he was one of, if not the best artist of the Renaissance and one of the best of all time. And he was also the wealthiest. And I think we creatives go, well, here's art and here's money. And if these things get too close together, it hurts the art. And in his case, it wasn't true. And I was like, well, who else is this not true for? In my case, as a writer, it wasn't true. I've done really well, much better than I expected to do. And I keep bumping into people that have one of two mindsets. Like you said, kind of the self-defeated, this will never work, I'm always going to starve, this is always going to be a side gig mindset. And that tends to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then I meet all of these entrepreneurial artists who are musicians and makers and writers and graphic designers and dancers and all kinds of different trades who are killing it, who are doing really, really well. And their mindset is different. And I think as it relates to money, the starving artist tends to despise the need for money. They don't like it. I have a friend who's a writer who goes, I hate money. I was like, bro, I get that. Like, I get that. Like, I may not want to love it, but hating it may not be the right attitude either. The thriving artist understands that she has to make money to make more art. And that idea comes from a quote from Walt Disney where somebody accused him mid-career when he was starting to become very successful. You're like, oh, you're just making films to make money. He said, no. We don't make films to make money. We make money so that we can make more films. And so I think the trick here is to understand that money makes a better means than a master, meaning you don't work for it, but you have to use it to do more work. If nothing else, it buys you time to create more. And as you know, if every night you're thinking, how am I going to pay my bills tomorrow or at the end of this month, that can hurt the creativity a little bit. At the same time, I don't think you need to have $1 million in the bank to be creative. We're all kind of dancing with this struggle to do honest work, but to also continue to fund the work. And yeah, I think the mindset is a very important shift. In the book, there's basically 3 parts. And the first shift is you got to change your mindset about this. When somebody tells me this will never work, I'm like, you're right. It'll never work. If you don't think you can, then you won't. And a thriving artist, if nothing else, kind of tricks themselves into thinking, well, maybe I could do this, so I'm going to give it a shot. And my hope with the book is because I talked to hundreds of thriving artists and captured a lot of their stories in the book. Again, not famous, not super successful people, not people with millions of fans, but a few thousand, is to just go, hey, this is possible. You don't have to starve. Look at what artists have always done. And so the book captures 500 years of history of creatives who have succeeded, from Jim Henson to Twyla Tharp to Steve Jobs and all kinds of other people, to people that today are applying these same rules and strategies and succeeding. So these are things I think that in one way or another have always worked. And understanding that you need to use money as a tool to continue to fuel the work, that's a very important idea.
And to tie it back into what you were saying earlier, make money to make more art, and then make more art to make more life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I do think there's a trap here. And I fell into this trap, to be honest. You do this thing and you get a paycheck. You go, well, that was fun. That was nice. Maybe I'll do that again, and you get another paycheck. And so then you get addicted to pressing that button to get more paychecks. And I don't think it's about the money, but there is something gratifying about doing something and somebody noticing it and rewarding you for it. And that's why I think it's very important to remember, okay, I'm not doing this for the money, but I need the money to keep doing the work. And then the money provides a life so that I can kind of hold all these things and balance life, money, and art.
Now let's talk about the artist who makes their art the thing that they know is their art, the thing they're called to create, right?
Yes.
And that thing is not wanted by the people that they're around. One of my favorite cellists, he did this really experimental looping stuff in the 80s out in New York. And he was gay. And so he had he just was in a weird scene. But now his music, after he's passed, because he died of AIDS, his music is now just wonderful. Everybody's eating it up. It was before his time. So What's an artist supposed to do when their art is not appreciated by their people?
Yeah, so I think this is one of those myths that like doesn't have to be true. And what I mean by that, because people are like, well, if you want to be appreciated, you have to die, right? There's this whole myth that like after you die, people will like your work. That's not true. I really don't think that's true. And you can take the example of Vincent van Gogh as sort of the stereotypical starving artist, right? Except that he wasn't. His brother bankrolled him for 10 years. He did, in fact, sell and trade a fair amount of paintings. But Van Gogh dies. He kills himself. And a few months after that, his brother, who was his patron and art dealer, who had been funding his work for the past 10 years, also died, which I didn't know about until recently. And so what happens is these two Van Gogh brothers die in the same year. And a woman named Johanna Van Gogh, who was Theo's wife, is left with all these paintings in her house. And she has to sell them, right? And so what does she do? But she reaches out to all these connections that Theo had. And then her father was also connected in the art dealer scene. And she starts reaching out to all these different fans and friends of Vincent and starts selling these paintings because she's got to get rid of them. And if it were not for her, I do not think Vincent van Gogh would be the household name he is today. So what preceded that? I mean, there's a couple of interesting things about that. One is she had connections. Two, like they had a little network between the three of them. Three, Vincent was actually a part of a scene, right? He was kind of a part of this impressionist, post-impressionist tribe. And for part of his career, he was learning from all these guys in Paris. And Theo actually introduced him to a lot of these people, and he was, learning from Monet and a lot of these contemporaries, and then eventually kind of went off and did his own thing and put his own spin on it. He was not wealthy. He was better paid than the guy who delivered his mail. That's a fact. He often furnished his dwelling places with pretty, elaborate furniture and stuff. So when he died, yes, his art did become very, very popular. The reason that happened was because he had a network of people that he had created, that he had gone out and found and kind of, built that and became part of that. And so there's a rule in the book called go join a scene. And that may mean that you have to move across the country, or it may mean that you have to move across the room, the coffee shop, the conference, wherever you are. It's a big world, 7-something billion people. I think it is practically impossible that there isn't someone out there who needs and wants and will resonate with your art. The challenge is we have to let them find us.
Right.
And this is where we do kind of have to step outside of, our introverted, artistic, little nests and find the audience that's intended for our art. And I think the first thing you have to do is go find a scene, go find a place where the kind of work that you're doing is encouraged. And it may not look like the place that you think it will. It may not be New York or LA or, Paris, because those were really popular scenes, not now, but a while ago. Patti Smith talks about in Just Kids how the reason all these artists were moving to New York is because it's a cheap place to live. Well, that's not exactly true anymore. Same thing with Paris in the 1920s and so on. So you have to find your scene. Then you have to connect with the people in that scene. And then ultimately those people help you find your audience, because what are we doing? We're all kind of helping each other. We're being each other's first fans and then helping one another share that work with each other. I do not think that it's necessary for you to die before people discover your work. And even when you do die, in the case of Van Gogh, the way we find your work is there was some small group of people who were a fan of you that then help you get the attention that you deserve. I would argue you don't have to wait until you die to see that.
Yeah. And there's some scenes where they end up like kind of resenting the one person that makes it big or goes successful.
Yeah. Yep.
And that is just not cool.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been a part of a couple of those groups, and it's not fun, because I know the truth that a rising tide does lift all the boats. If the boats aren't anchored to the bottom with short anchors, right?
Or if the boats aren't like blasting cannonballs at each other.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, this is challenging, right? When you're part of a group of people and you see one of your friends and it's not you and they take off, like that's hard. I've been a part of that. I have friends that are way more successful than me, and we got the same start. And I just have to remember a couple of things. One, they typically work harder than I do. Two, like they're running their own race, and that is the interesting challenge about being a creative, is the timing of your success rarely aligns with the expectations of your success. And all I know is this is my work. My first job is to do it. My second job is to find a way to make a living off of it so that I can keep doing it. After that, I don't know where this will go. Does it have to go to mega successful stardom? No. Like, I have to remind myself at the end of the day, when I started this 6-7 years ago, when I started dreaming of being a writer, what I have achieved is so far beyond what I imagined. So this is all kind of gravy. Like, yeah. I started with very low expectations. I didn't think writers could make a living. Well, I'm doing that. So I'm like, okay, once you achieve a certain goal or you see somebody else do something better, you're like, okay, now I want that. I'm not promising that. I'm not promising that you can, be Michael Jackson, but I am promising that you can thrive, that you can make a living off of your art if you're willing to do the work. And I think one of the most common but worst obstacles facing an artist is jealousy. And I think a little bit of competition drives you, but there is a point where you just go, okay, this is my lane. I'm going to stay in it and focus on my work. And I cannot be jealous of somebody else's calling. I don't know what their path is. And every time I'm tempted to go, oh, I should write like that person, or I should do that, I think about some of my favorite musicians and artists. And never once does it cross my mind, oh, Picasso was richer than Monet, so Monet should have painted more like Picasso, right? Like, that would never cross my mind because their styles are so distinct and I like them both. I would never want one of them to go, I'm going to stop doing this, I'm going to do it like that, because that person is more successful. So like, there is something about just the character of the work that you have to be true to and not worry too much about the results. Because again, it isn't about the results. It's not about the success. That hopefully is a means to do more of the work that you feel led to do.
Oh, this has been so great. Thank you for coming. This has been fantastic. I know that everybody in the Facebook group of listeners is going to love this. And I also know that everybody else who's listening is going to really get a lot out of this. So thank you so much for showing up fully for this. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Emily. It's a great conversation, great questions, and thanks for leading the way and setting a great example of creativity and vulnerability. I think those things are important and they go together, and I appreciate your model for that.
Well, thank you. Your brave takeaway from today's episode is this. I want you to follow this episode up by making a list of reasons why you are different than the people around you. Sometimes objectively looking at our strengths and our uniquenesses are all we need to see that, in fact, we do have the potential to be successful and to be a thriving person, a thriving artist, a thriving business owner. So take a minute and look at your surroundings and make a list of all the reasons why you're different than your surroundings. I know that Jeff and I would love to hear all about your favorite parts of today's Bare Naked Bravery. You can find Jeff Goins and myself on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and all the other places. And the links to all of Jeff's stuff, his books and his websites and everything, all of that is in the show notes for this episode. You can go to Bare Naked Bravery for all of that. And I know that he would really love to hear from you. So if you enjoyed this episode as much as Jeff and I enjoyed making it for you, then I encourage you to give the show a rating and a review in iTunes. That really helps out a lot. But also, if you want to continue this conversation about what it means to be a thriving artist versus a starving artist, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it in the Facebook group. We've got the Bare Naked Bravery Facebook group. So just type into Facebook, Bare Naked Bravery, 3 words, and you'll be prompted to answer 2 questions so we can help weed out the weirdos. That's a fun phrase. Say that 3 times fast. This conversation about being a thriving or a starving artist is an important one, and I want to make sure that if you have questions, we get to answer them. So Jeff and I will be in the Facebook group ready to answer any questions you have about all of this. So we will see you in there. If you are digging the music in today's episode, that is because it's brought to you by my friends at Music Box Licensing, a premier creative music agency dedicated to finding and crafting unique soundtracks. To find out more about all the artists, musicians, and other sponsors of the show, go to barenakedbravery.com/sponsors. This week is going to be so rad. We've got some awesome things in store for you. So keep your ears peeled and your eyes to the ground. I always say that backwards. Oh my gosh. Until then though, you guys, I have one message for you as always. It is this. Be yourself. Be vulnerable, be improvisational, be imaginative, be brave, because the world needs more of your bare naked bravery.